The fog thickened over Whitechapel, curling through its narrow alleys like a predator stalking its prey, smothering gaslights and casting shadows that seemed alive. It was not just the damp air or the acrid stench of soot and decay that unsettled the district's inhabitants. It was something intangible, something unseen, yet felt. By the autumn of 1888, Whitechapel had become a crucible of fear, its every corner carrying whispers of a name: Jack the Ripper. Whitechapel was not merely a setting, it was a living, breathing character in this grim drama. The East End of London stood in stark contrast to the opulent West End, where wealth and privilege flourished. In Whitechapel, life was raw and unrelenting. Overcrowded tenements loomed over streets slick with waste, and open sewers snaked through alleys that reeked of rot. Immigrants fleeing persecution mingled with laborers scraping by on meager wages, while women like Mary Ann Nichols, Annie Chapman, Elizabeth Stride, Catherine Eddowes, and Mary Jane Kelly walked the streets at night, exchanging their bodies for pennies to keep hunger at bay. The social conditions in Whitechapel were not just a backdrop, but an integral part of the story. This was a district where desperation hung in the air like the ever-present smog, where the vulnerable were preyed upon not just by killers, but by a society that ignored their suffering. For women, particularly those who had fallen on hard times, the options were few and the risks were great. What kind of world forces its most vulnerable to navigate such treacherous paths? And in such a world, is it any surprise that a killer could move so freely, preying on those who were least protected? The Ripper's first confirmed victim, Mary Ann Nichols, was discovered in Bucks Row on August 31st, 1888. By the time of her death, Mary had been estranged from her family for years, her children living elsewhere, her life reduced to a series of lodging houses and the hard grind of survival. What did Nichols see in her final moments? Was her killer's face familiar, or was he just another shadow in a district filled with them? Less than 2 weeks later, Annie Chapman became his next victim. On September 8th, her body was found in the backyard of 29 Hanbury Street, her throat cut and her abdomen brutally mutilated. Born in 1841, Annie's life had also begun with promise. She married John Chapman, a coachman, and the couple lived a relatively stable life in Windsor. However, the deaths of their children, likely due to tuberculosis, drove Annie into despair. She turned to alcohol for solace, a vice that eventually fractured her marriage. Elizabeth Stride, the Ripper's third victim, presents a more enigmatic figure. Discovered on September 30th, Stride's body bore the marks of a killer interrupted, her throat slashed, but her body otherwise untouched. Her final hours were spent near Burner Street, where she was seen with a man described as well-dressed, carrying a small package. Catherine Eddowes' murder, committed just 45 minutes after Stride's, was a horrifying escalation. Eddowes, born in 1842, had lived a life marked by intelligence and wit, qualities that endeared her to those who knew her despite her struggles with poverty and alcohol. Her mutilated body, found in Mitre Square, was marked by grotesque violence, her face slashed, her kidney removed, and her womb taken. By November, the city was in the grip of hysteria. The press had seized upon the murders with a fervor that bordered on obsession, transforming Jack the Ripper into a household name. Mary Jane Kelly, the Ripper's final victim, was perhaps the most tragic of all. Born in Ireland around 1863, Kelly was the youngest of the victims and, by some accounts, the most beautiful. Kelly's body was mutilated beyond recognition, her organs scattered around the room in a scene so horrifying that even seasoned investigators were left shaken. Was this the crescendo of his killing spree, a final statement before he disappeared? Or was it simply the last chapter of a story interrupted by fate? And then, silence. After Kelly's murder, the killings stopped as abruptly as they had begun. The Ripper vanished, leaving behind a trail of bodies and questions. Did he die, flee, or simply choose to stop? Theories abound, but the truth remains elusive. The investigation into the Ripper murders was one of the largest and most exhaustive of its time. Detectives from Scotland Yard combed through Whitechapel, interviewing hundreds of witnesses and pursuing countless leads. Yet no arrest was ever made, and the case remains unsolved to this day. Jack the Ripper's legacy is as much about the world he inhabited as the crimes he committed. His murders exposed the inequalities and prejudices of Victorian society, forcing a spotlight onto the plight of Whitechapel's poor. Yet even as we seek to understand him, we are confronted by the darker questions his story raises. The story of Jack the Ripper endures because it is unfinished, its questions unanswered, its darkness unresolved. He was a product of his time, but he transcends it, a figure who forces us to confront the fragility of civilization and the depths of human depravity. His name has become a symbol, not just of the violence he inflicted, but of the fears that still lurk in our collective consciousness. As we walk the fog-shrouded streets of Whitechapel, we are left with more questions than answers. Jack the Ripper remains a shadow, a figure who defies understanding even as he compels our curiosity. In the end, perhaps the Ripper's greatest crime was not the lives he took, but the silence he left behind, a void that continues to haunt us over a century later. Why are we so captivated by monsters? Is it because we see them as alien to us, or because we fear they are closer than we dare admit? Let us know what you think in the comments. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel if you'd like to see more videos like these.